It was Christmas Eve, and heavy snow was falling. The Johnson family had gathered in their suburban home to celebrate this special night. Mike and Sarah, the parents, along with their three children, Emily, Jason, and Lily, were sitting by the fireplace, opening presents. The sound of laughter and joy filled the house. Suddenly, a thud was heard from upstairs. Mike looked at his wife in surprise and said, "Honey, what was that sound?" Sarah shrugged and replied, "Probably just the wind rattling a window." "Don't worry about it." But the sound continued, this time louder and clearer. It was as if someone was walking in the room upstairs. The children looked at their parents with fear. Mike tried to maintain his composure. "I'll go upstairs and check it out. You all stay here." He cautiously climbed the stairs. His heart was pounding. When he reached the upstairs hallway, he noticed that the master bedroom door was ajar. With a trembling hand, he grasped the handle and gently pushed the door open. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. A man in a Santa Claus costume, but with a terrifying mask and a large knife in hand, stood in the middle of the room. Before Mike could react, the man attacked with incredible speed. Mike's horrifying scream echoed throughout the house. Sarah jumped up in terror and shouted, "Mike, what happened?" But there was no answer. Only the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the stairs could be heard. Sarah hid the children behind her and stared fearfully at the living room entrance. The man in the Santa Claus costume entered the room, his knife red with Mike's blood. His eyes gleamed behind the mask, and he let out a demonic laugh. "Ho, ho, ho, Merry Christmas!" Sarah screamed and tried to guide the children towards the back door, but the killer was faster. With one quick motion, he plunged the knife into Sarah's side. She fell to the floor in pain. The children screamed in horror and tried to escape. Emily, the oldest child, grabbed her younger sibling's hands and ran towards the basement. The killer calmly followed them, as if enjoying this chase. In the dark, damp basement, the children tried to hide behind old boxes. The killer's footsteps grew closer and closer. Jason, the middle child, was shaking with fear and crying, "Shh, stay calm." Emily tried to comfort her brother, but she was also breathless with fear. Suddenly, the killer's terrifying laugh came from behind them. "Found you, naughty children." Emily tried with all her might to defend against the killer, but he was much stronger. With one powerful blow, he slammed Emily against the wall. Jason and Lily screamed and begged. The killer mercilessly continued his work. The horrific scenes that unfolded in that basement were indescribable. Blood covered everything, and the children's screams and pleas gradually faded. When it was all over, the killer looked around with satisfaction. He had done his job well. He slowly climbed the basement stairs and entered the living room. The Christmas tree was still shining, and unopened gifts were displayed beneath it. The killer sat on the couch and picked up one of the Christmas cookies. As he chewed, he murmured, "What a quiet night. What a good Christmas." The next morning, neighbors noticed the strange silence from the Johnsons' house. When the police arrived, they were confronted with a scene that shocked even the most experienced officers. The family that had been joyfully celebrating Christmas the night before had now been brutally murdered. But this wasn't the end of the story. In the following days, news of similar murders in surrounding towns was reported. A killer who called himself Santa Claus had struck terror into people's hearts. No one knew who the next victim would be, or where this murderous Santa might appear. The police put all their efforts into finding this serial killer, but he vanished like a ghost. Every time they found a trace of him, The next murder happened in a different location. People no longer dared to celebrate Christmas. Christmas trees were taken down, and decorative lights remained off. Fear had replaced joy. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, the Wilson family was sitting in their home. They had decided to celebrate Christmas privately, despite the general fear. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Mr. Wilson hesitantly went to the door and looked through the peephole. A man in a Santa Claus costume was standing outside. Mr. Wilson's heart stopped in fear. He quietly told his wife, "Call the police, he's here." But before they could do anything, the door burst open with a loud crash, and the killer Santa entered the house. His eyes gleamed behind the mask, and his knife shone in the light of the lamps. Merry Christmas, dear family. I hope you're ready for a bloody celebration. If you enjoyed it so far, please hit the subscribe button if you liked the video. The screams of the Wilson family echoed through the cold Christmas night, but no one dared to come to their aid. Everyone knew that the killer Santa had returned to town. In the years that followed, the story of the killer Santa became a terrifying legend. Parents used this story to scare their children, and teenagers told it to each other on dark nights. But no one knew if this was just a story or a reality that could repeat at any moment. Every year, as Christmas approached, fear crept into people's hearts. Would the killer Santa return this year? Would they be the next family? These questions occupied everyone's minds. The police were still trying to find this mysterious killer, but every time they thought they were close to him, he disappeared. Some believed he was a ghost, an avenger who had come from the world of the dead to destroy the joy of Christmas. Others thought he was an ordinary person, someone who lived among us and only turned into a monster on Christmas Eve. In one of these years, a group of students decided to investigate this killer. They examined all the files related to the Christmas murders and tried to find a pattern. One of the students, Sarah, noticed something strange. At all crime scenes, an old toy had been found. A small wooden doll that seemed to belong 2 decades ago. Sarah excitedly told her friends, "Maybe this doll is the key to solving the mystery. We need to find out where this doll came from." The group began to investigate the doll. They discovered that this doll had been produced by a toy factory in a small town called Pine Creek. This factory had been destroyed in a mysterious fire years ago. Sarah and her friends decided to go to Pine Creek to investigate further. When they arrived, they were confronted with an abandoned and scary town. It was as if time had stopped in this town. They met an old man who had worked in that factory for years. The old man said in a trembling voice, "That fire wasn't an accident. It was Christmas Eve, and all the workers were celebrating. But one of the workers, a man named Jack, was angry. He thought the factory owner had wronged him. Jack decided to take revenge." The old man's story shocked Sarah and her friends. Jack had died in that fire, but before his death, he had sworn to take revenge. Was it possible that Jack's spirit returned every Christmas Eve to take revenge? The group of students decided to spend Christmas Eve in the ruins of the factory. They wanted to see if they could confront Jack's spirit and end this nightmare. Christmas Eve arrived. Sarah and her friends were waiting in the ruins of the factory. It was close to midnight when they heard footsteps. Their hearts were pounding heavily. Suddenly, a man in a Santa Claus costume with a terrifying mask appeared before them. He had a knife in his hand and was laughing demonically. Sarah said in a trembling voice, "Jack, we know who you are. We know what happened, but this isn't the way. Taking revenge on innocent people won't solve anything." For a moment, it seemed that Sarah's words had an effect. The killer Santa stood still and stared at them, but suddenly, he attacked them with incredible speed. The scene that followed was more horrifying than anything ever seen before. The students' screams echoed through the empty space of the factory, but there was no one to help them. The next morning, the police were confronted with a horrific scene. All members of the research group had been brutally murdered, and again, the same old wooden doll was found at the crime scene. This incident caused fear and terror in the community to reach its peak. No one felt safe anymore. Christmas had turned from a joyous celebration into a terrifying nightmare. Years passed, and the story of the killer Santa continued. Every year, on Christmas Eve, a family would fall victim. Police and ordinary people were all trying to end this nightmare, but no one succeeded. Until one day, just before Christmas, the police released a statement. They announced that they had finally managed to arrest the killer. The news spread like wildfire in the community. Everyone wanted to know who this ruthless killer was. But when the killer's identity was revealed, everyone was shocked. It was none other than the town's mayor, a man who had been trying to find the killer for years. He confessed that all these years, he himself had been the killer. The mayor said in court, "I just wanted to remind people how lucky they are. I wanted to show them how fragile life is." Every year, when people were immersed in joy and happiness, I brought them back to the harsh reality of life. These confessions shocked the community. The person who was supposed to protect them was the source of terror and fear. People's trust in officials was destroyed, and fear gave way to anger and despair. However, the arrest of the killer wasn't the end of the story. On the first Christmas after the mayor's arrest, when everyone thought they could celebrate peacefully, another murder occurred. This time, too, the same wooden doll was found at the crime scene. Was the mayor not the only killer? Was someone else involved in this? Or perhaps, as some believed, Jack's spirit really existed and continued his killings. These questions remained unanswered, and fear continued to rule the town. Every year, as Christmas approached, people waited in horror to see what would happen. Would the killer Santa appear again? Would they be the next family? The story of the killer Santa became a legend that was passed down from generation to generation. Even years later, when no more murders occurred, people still looked at Christmas with fear. The joy and cheer of this celebration had forever been accompanied by a shadow of fear and terror. And every year, on Christmas Eve, if you listened carefully, you could hear a demonic laugh in the wind, a sound that reminded of a nightmare that never ended.